Okay, well, thank you everybody very much for joining us today on what we hope to be a really engaging event. So our session today is the vulnerability profile. So we have asked external organisations to come up with some stats and statistics after speaking with members of the public on how they are experiencing vulnerabilities and questions and answers around that sort of thing. So we're going to give you a bit more stats on that. My name is Kirsty Gatter, formerly Kirsty Brookman, because I got married at the beginning of the month in COVID, which was the silliest thing that I've ever done in my life, but we got it done and I'm really, really pleased. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to my colleague, Helen Lord. So me and Helen will be doing the presentation sort of jointly between the two of us. We have got a couple of polls that are in the middle of the presentations as well. Here we go.
Fabulous. Thank you. Okay, so morning everybody. Thanks ever so much for attending today. What it's all about really is we are sort of conscious that we're building this data set of vulnerable individuals, and we're conscious that it's quite a unique data set. The data doesn't really exist anywhere else. We're collating it from sources where individuals or people acting on their behalf are highlighting the fact that they're vulnerable, putting their hands up, wanting organisations to become aware of it. And so I've been increasingly conscious that it's worthwhile looking at the type of people that are registering, seeing if that shows us any trends, things that we can learn from as well. And the other thing that we've done is we have done a consumer survey to answer some of the questions, I guess, that we get asked all the time around what people's views are about sharing vulnerability data, the willingness to do so, when they do so. So what we've done, if we look at the next slide, we've worked with several organisations. So we have done our survey through census-wide, and that's really looking at who wants to share data, what their experiences are, how they feel organisations are treating them, and what sort of people, what age groups are how it affects them. So we've done the survey and we'll share some of the high-level results of that with you. Also, we took our database, an element of our database, and for want of a better word, we've done some profiling against it to see the types of people that are registering it. And we've done it three ways. We've done through CACI, Acorn, and I think Gina's on the webinar today. So we felt it was really important to look at demographics, social factors. We've also looked at it through Origins Info, through Richard Webber, if any of you know him. I came across him many years ago at Experian. He was the originator of Acorn and also Experian Mosaic. So he's put an angle on our data, and also working with LNEV. LNEV have done great work in terms of building their vulnerability assessment classification service. And we collaborate with them, and we've looked against them to see whether what the data we're holding matches really against their model. The good news is for all of us looking to identify potential vulnerability in any sort of models, it does seem to really work. So there's a brilliant tool there. So the results that we're going to share with you this morning are really an amalgam of all those things, and the same trends prove true the more we look at it. We have a growing database. I'm sure we'll learn more as we move forward, but certainly the trends that we found are very profound, and I think they hold true. Next slide, Kirsty, Heidi. Just to sort of summarise where we get our data from, just to put it into perspective really. We get information either directly from individuals saying that they're vulnerable, and we check to make sure it is the individual registering. We obviously don't go around and check how vulnerable they are, but that's where that information comes from. If somebody has a power of attorney in place, so if I had a power of attorney over a parent, I could register them. We would validate that before registering it. Court of protection orders, we've got a building data set of court of protection order data, and again, this isn't held anywhere else, it's not collated anywhere else, and we go primarily to local authorities, councils, and obtain data whereby individuals are have a court protection order because they are unable to manage their own financial affairs, really owing to mental capacity issues. And I mean, the more we hold this, the more significant we see it. I mean, these people are still often obtaining mobile phone contracts, vehicle finance contracts, and really this data is really giving a heads up, you know, these people shouldn't be obtaining those sort of finances. And then the other way is through charities, debt management companies, and users, our clients. So registration with us is free. Obviously, it needs to have a legal basis to be shared. All the data protection issues are totally covered off. But through charities, through clients, through debt management companies, it means that we've got another source of data. And it means that if an organisation, they may know that they're dealing with a vulnerable individual, there may be another 20, 30 organisations that individual's dealing with who don't know they're vulnerable. And we break down the data we hold through flags, and there's a summary there on the right-hand side of them. And I think they match really against the needs of any sector, any industry, really. There are nuances, we're aware of that. Utilities, for example, have their priority services codes, but they do map across and they do still give that indicator of vulnerability. Things like physical disability, cognitive disorder, financial hardship, financial capacity. Certainly the financial side of it, I think we have more of a handle on, and I think we're increasingly doing so in terms of vulnerability. Some of the other areas, I think we're growing our understanding of, and those are the areas that we really can't predict. We can't predict that somebody's going to have a life cycle event such as a bereavement or a relationship breakdown. We can't really predict how mental health is going to impact on somebody. And I think that's why what we're doing to us is so important. It's real people stating that they have a vulnerability rather than us making assumptions about them. I think the other one that's worth mentioning there, risk of coercion. I'm really keen to pursue this because I don't think anywhere there's an easy way of people flagging if they're at risk of financial abuse. And we're starting to do that, working with charities who can act on people's behalf, because obviously we don't want to communicate directly with the victim. But again, I just think it's really important. And if we look at the stats, the figures, it's a lot bigger than any of us would have hoped. So I think we're just going to do a quick poll, and then I'm going to, after that, we'll have a look at those results and hand over to Kirsty to give you some of the key stats that we found. So, basic question, do you feel your organisation knows who your vulnerable customers are? I have a range of responses when this question's asked, so if you're happy to just say yes, no, or not sure, that'd be really interesting.
Impressed with the speed of people actually answering the question.
Are you going to bring up the results now, Heidi?
Yeah, we're sort of 79% of people. So has everybody pressed your buttons? If you've all pressed your buttons, I can launch the results.
Yeah, I've pressed mine.
Okay, well, it's 80% of people that have pressed the button, so I will just end it there, and I'll share the results for you. There you go.
And I think, you know, it's great that organisations do feel that they know who they are. I mean, the range of responses I get are, and it depends on sector, because some sectors obviously have less direct day-to-day, if you like, interaction with their customers, so they can't be expected to definitely know and preempt things. But we have a lot of organisations who say we already know who our customers are, and I think that's fantastic. I think my message is always going to be, they might be dealing with another 10 organisations who don't actually know they're vulnerable. We do sometimes have organisations that say we don't have any vulnerable customers, and I'm sure none of you on this would probably agree with that, otherwise you wouldn't be here. And again, we only have to look at some of the figures around things like dementia, carers, the rate of mental illness, etc. So you must have some And I think the other possibility sometimes is that there's a worry that there's too many vulnerable customers out there to actually be able to manage and deal with. So, I mean, I think that's positive. I'll hand over to Kirsty, who'll run through some of the findings that we've managed to come to.
Lovely, thank you. If you want to stop sharing the polling question, Heidi, and move on to slide 5. Lovely. Thank you. So this slide is based off of our survey results for individuals who considered themselves to be vulnerable in line with the FCA's definition of social, physical, emotional and a mental perspective. So as you can see, it's 34% of people asked felt that they were vulnerable in line with the definition. A third of people asked said that they were already aware of the FCA's guidelines, which we were initially quite surprised at, because obviously not everyone sort of lives in the world that we work in with regards to vulnerability. So it was a pleasant surprise because it's quite a large amount of people. So the FCA's statement that 40% of the adult population, is about 27.7 million people, show characteristics of vulnerability. So our data sort of is very close to that with the 34%. So it marries up with the FCA's statement. 10% more women identify as vulnerable as opposed to men, which is consistent across the board in all of our survey results today. The 55 and over are almost half as likely to identify as vulnerable, which we were quite surprised at, as we felt like if you got to sort of the 80 plus age bracket, you might expect them to identify more with feeling more vulnerable. And 19% of over 55 would say that they were vulnerable. If you move on to the next slide, please, Heidi. Okay, so this is the breakdown of the information that's on our own database. So it's fairly consistent with the previous slide, with 30 to 40% more likely to identify, so the 30 to 40 age bracket more likely to identify as vulnerable at 35%. This data is obviously not widely available, so this is purely from the VRS database. So if anybody does have any queries about being able to access us, please do let us know by the end of this presentation. Next slide, please, Heidi. I keep saying Kaylee, I'm not sure why. Okay, so do you consider yourself to be vulnerable? So all these areas for capability, women seem to feature more highly than that. So if you see on the right-hand side, you've got the key code here. So in blue, you've got all. In orange, you've got health, purple, life events, resilience, and capability, which I'll explain in more detail. Younger people may be more susceptible to redundancy or using more credit, which might explain the highness of the rating for that age bracket. It might be that older people are more established or less likely to use the credit facilities. So what we mean by health is that could include physical and mental health difficulties. Mental health is the area that people most identify with, other than financial vulnerability, and far more younger people are suffering from mental health issues in the 30 to 40 bracket. This could potentially be due to social media exposure or having more access to sharing platforms. Again, this is speculation, it's just my own sort of personal thoughts on this. The life events in purple, so that could be relationship breakdown or bereavement or any job loss. Resilience in the yellow, so struggling to withstand emotional or financial shocks or financial stress, mental health or difficulty coping. And capability, so that's a level of a person's understanding of financial affairs, like managing money or English or literacy skills. You want to move on to the next slide, Heidi? So this is the types of vulnerability. So in blue, this is all of the people asked. In red, this is the male population, and yellow is women. Men seem to feel that they are more likely to be coerced than women. So women were overall more likely to experience vulnerabilities or just share the fact that they were experiencing vulnerabilities from this slide. But from the COVID mark here, we sort of seem to feel that the full impact from COVID hasn't really been felt entirely yet as a result of furlough and the payment holidays that people are still experiencing. So when these are no longer in place, we feel that there may be an increase in vulnerability expected, as there have been millions and millions of people that have taken payment holidays. As a result of taking the repayment holidays, this will potentially mean that people will be less likely to be able to access cheaper credit in the long term. That would be what we would expect. Again, older people are less likely to identify with any of these, particularly hardly anyone in the age bracket identifying with gambling and addiction. Physical health issues are even more prevalent than those in the 35 age bracket, which again, we were quite surprised at. Those impacted by fraud would still be obviously in a vulnerable position, but they are factoring a bit lower in this slide. Heidi, if you'd like to move on to the next slide, please. So this is the impact of vulnerability in the last 12 months. So in this list, priority debts such as mortgage, council tax and utility bills are featuring quite low in this sort of area, which could be due to the fact that people not understanding the priorities when it comes to paying bills, such as paying your credit card bills versus paying your council tax. Obviously, council tax is a higher importance than paying your credit card, but people don't seem to realise this in the long term. 12% of people feel that they are more at risk of homelessness, which is quite scary for those poor people that are experiencing those feelings of vulnerability at the moment. Post-COVID, the restrictions on private landlords will be removed, so people finding themselves facing eviction will increase. Heidi, if you want to move on to the next one. So these are some quotes from regulators and stakeholders alike. We've highlighted the areas in this slide and the next slide over, which will stay in this slide for the moment, which we feel are quite sort of prevalent to data sharing, which is what obviously the VRS is looking to provide. So you've got information there from the FCA, information from Ofwat and the Gambling Commission. So Ofwat saying that data sharing may help companies to recognise affordability issues much earlier. The Gambling Commission saying the same as well.
No, yeah.
Heidi, if you want to move on to the next slide. So again, yeah, with citizens' advice, people in vulnerable situations should not be asked to submit the same information, the same similar purposes over and over. We try to express this with regards to the vulnerability restoration service. We are hoping to become the one-stop shop for people, so they don't have to keep repeating themselves over and over again. If you're having to repeat the same vulnerabilities, that's going to make you feel a lot worse and probably impact your mental health more. So as you can see across the organisations that we've sort of shared with you guys here, that data sharing is the key to helping people. So you've got University of Bristol saying the same thing, an association of British insurers as well. So we've got one more poll. Heidi, if you'd like to share that for us, for you guys, if you're ready to answer for us. So do you agree that sharing data about vulnerability would help to support your customers? If you could write yes, if you click yes, or click no, or click if you're unsure, that would be great. And we'll share the results as soon as we've got a majority of people that have selected the options.
Okay, we're still receiving some votes here, so. Okay, right, so I shall just share the results of this poll.
Lovely, thank you, Heidi.
There you go.
That's a resounding yes. Helen, you're on mute, sorry.
I said that's a relief. It gives me a reason for existing.
Doesn't it give us all a reason for existing? Fantastic.
I mean, that's great to know. I mean, the points that Kirsty have made, the real takeaways for me are, I mean, priority debt you know, that there are a lot of people clearly have been affected by priority debt over the last 12 months. I think the point with it that Kirsty was making is, and certainly in the conversations we've had, I think people don't actually always recognise what is priority debt and what isn't, and they might prioritise things that they shouldn't be doing. And I certainly get the feeling that there's room for education out there. Mental health is proving to be significant across the board. I mean, we have a lot of data about financial hardship. We know a lot about financial data, but mental health is increasingly a big issue. Women 10% more likely to identify as vulnerable than men, whether that's because they're more likely to say so, I don't know. But what I'll show you in a minute is that they're slightly less likely to share the fact that they're vulnerable or not. And the other big takeaway, I think, is the older people are, the less likely they are to identify as vulnerable. And we are surprised about that because of all the obvious implications about getting older. So what we found around people communicating about vulnerability, and it is a fear whether people actually do want to share the fact that they're in a vulnerable situation. And what we're really finding is 56% of people would actually tell if they were asked. 67% believe that organisations should be putting checks into place to identify vulnerability. And 64% would share details of vulnerability if it means they will receive better support from organisations. So I think there is a proactivity there. They are happy to do that if they feel that they will receive the support. And I don't think any of us would ever expect everybody to want to share the fact, but the percentage is quite high. 41% feel they've been unfairly treated with regard to their vulnerability in the last 12 months, which is, again, it's high. And 45% have dealt with an organisation on behalf of a vulnerable family member or friend. And I wanted to ask that question because I just think there is such significant pressure upon people who are in the position of carer. It can potentially put them in a vulnerable situation themselves. And I know from bitter personal experience the difficulties of trying to act on somebody's behalf, because again, you know, there's always the data protection issue. And it makes it a little bit more difficult and a little bit more complicated. And the figures around the time it takes people to actually get the message across to organisations, it's varied. Some of them are okay. Some of them we're clearly doing a good job with. I mean, and then we have 8% have been trying to communicate the fact that they're vulnerable to organisations for over 10 years. Now, some of that I think we have to accept, you know, there may be reasons for that, but I mean, there is quite a high proportion where there's a time lag. So, I mean, I've just picked out a few examples here. 25% of people experiencing a life event say it's taken them maybe 6 months to actually convey that fact to the organisations that they're dealing with. And I guess if it's a life event like a bereavement, 6 months is a long time to actually get that message through. So next slide, Heidi. So reasons for not disclosing vulnerability. The fact that some people don't think it would make a difference is the highest. And again, that actually the highest group in terms of age that don't think it would make a difference are the elderly. They don't think there's any point in doing it. And then we've got some things, not sure that people would care, don't think the information will be treated sensitively, too scary and overwhelming. And I think that always hits home very much when somebody's in a huge amount of debt, in difficult situations. I mean, being bombarded by letters, calls, whatever it is. I think, you know, if you're in a vulnerable situation, the word overwhelming, I think it is something that would resonate. And then you've got your aspects around trying to contact the right person in an organisation. Organisations making it difficult to speak to them, worried. And I think those areas really, you know, make the point. If an organisation knows somebody's vulnerable, does that enable them then to fast track an individual, get them to speak to the right person more quickly and stop the pain of having to navigate their way through call centres and speak to multiple people? And then there's a concern with some people about whether it will affect their credit worthiness. And it's something I've always been very conscious of. Will people think that? Do they think they're going to get a big mark on the credit report that will say I'm vulnerable, and will that result in them being automatically declined credit? And consequently, we have audits, we have processes in place to monitor how data is being used. And I think it's very important to again make sure that people don't think it will have a negative effect on them. I think the other thing we drew out of this, 2 in 5 people have felt unfairly treated by an organisation not taking their circumstances into account in the last 12 months. So, you know, it's I think we're certainly getting there. I think we're certainly getting there in terms of our awareness about how important it is to train customer service staff, people speaking to these people, and also the flip side is being concerned about those staff themselves and having to deal with vulnerable customers all the time. And you know, we work with various organisations. I think we've got VCX on the call today. There's huge progress, I think, in recognising the need to have that training around dealing with vulnerability. Okay, Heidi. So this is the experience of discussing vulnerability, and some of it is good, I think. Some of it shows that we're getting there. So the negative sides, 35% found repeating circumstances to different departments difficult. And I think that was one of our main objectives when we started out with this. It's the fact that if somebody's in a vulnerable position, they're sort of self-conscious, they're down, it's difficult. Do they want to keep telling different people the same thing again and again and again? And I think that's a barrier for people actually communicating it in the first place. 32% felt that they were passed around to different people, left on hold, having to deal with automated messages, and 29% just finding it difficult to find the right person or the right department to speak to. But on the positive side, 30% felt that they'd been treated with empathy, which relates back to what I was saying before about that training and that awareness. So, I mean, that I think is positive, and I think we're really starting to get somewhere with that. And 29% felt that the organisation had acted on what they'd been told, I suppose, which is different to just having a sympathetic ear. It's just, we can all say, oh dear, but do organisations actually factor that into account? And again, it's sort of 50-50 on the negative and the positive side with what people were telling us. Thanks, Heidi. So what I've learned through this process, talking to people, looking at stats, figures, vulnerability isn't a singular thing. It's multifaceted, and what's becoming more and more obvious, particularly with people self-registering with us, is that if they have one vulnerability, there's a likelihood they'll have several. They can't just say, I'm in debt. There's a good chance that their mental health might be suffering because of those vulnerable circumstances. And the flip side is true. If somebody's in a situation where their mental health is not good, then they're more likely to be in debt. And I think it applies with many of the flags that we've got. Sometimes we're getting 4 or 5 of those flags that are being ticked when people are contacting us. So it's not simple. And I think the other side of it is that, and I mentioned it earlier, is that one individual may be vulnerable. We might hold a record about an individual being vulnerable, but it might be relevant and is likely to be relevant to many, many different organisations. So it's not necessarily enough for one organisation to know about a vulnerability. It's so essential that it's shared. And this sort of random scattered diagram I've done on the right, I put together yesterday, which is just me, really. And the reason I did it really was because I keep saying, well, an individual is likely to have 20 different touch points, and they're going to potentially have to communicate a situation to all of those. So I thought, well, let's see if it's true. So this is me. These are off the top of my head, really, the number of touch points that I have with organisations. Bear in mind, I am carer for my mother as well, so that complicates the issue. It doubles up several different things. It also makes life a lot more complicated when dealing with organisations. But this doesn't include any individual sort of relationships with organisations that my husband would have. And without thinking about it too deeply, there's 31 different touch points there to 31 different organisations, although I seem to have doubled up the television license thing, only because my mother hates paying her television license. And I think the other aspect of something like that, something we take for granted, that's very, very simple to deal with that, you know, it's all these things are complicated. It's a wad of paper coming through the post, something that somebody already objects to doing, with 3 different ways of paying. And if you're on pension credit, yes, you can opt out of it, but you've got to fill in lots of forms to tell somebody you're on pension credit to opt out of it. And I think going back to what I was saying about people being overwhelmed, really, it's not surprising. If they're in a vulnerable situation, it just makes it much worse. Thanks, Heidi. So we've looked at geographical breakdown of where people are most likely to register. And as I said, we have a growing database, and I think some of these trends will alter a little bit, but the breakdown and these trends are so significant. I think that this will hang true, however much we increase our data, however many contributors we have. And there is an uncanny skew towards the northwest. It is significant. And I've broken down the postcodes, and you'll see that most of them, we've got Preston, Warrington, Blackburn, Bolton, Liverpool, Oldham, Wigan, Manchester, and some elements of Cheshire. What we don't seem to get a big representation from, and this proves true with what we've done looking at our own data and the analyses we've had done on it, particularly with Acorn, is that there isn't such a big representation in rural areas. It's far more city-based, town-based. So the only areas really that are significant, that really stand out from what I've looked at, that aren't based in the northwest, are around the Doncaster region, some in South Yorkshire. So we've got Sheffield on there, and also we've got an element up in Scotland around Motherwell, Hamilton. Looking at these areas, there is significant unemployment in all these specific postcodes, and I've looked at it at postcode level. So if we look at, say, 4% unemployment, which was the figure I'm going on, some of these areas have 22% employment rates. And they're also, all of these are predominantly white areas. They aren't that significantly ethnically diverse. That's not to say the rest of our database doesn't reflect ethnicity, but these specific postcodes do certainly show that. Okay, next slide, please. I think just what this shows, we've got UK coverage. As I say, rural areas sometimes will have hardly any records. In the sort of dark red areas, we have significant coverage. And again, looking at the models, this is a model, you know, a map produced by LNF. It's showing the same sort of scattering, and you can certainly see definite postcode areas where vulnerability is entirely, it is very, very true. And I just, on the next slide, I just sort of did a bit of research, because I'd seen recently some figures around the COVID rate in Greater Manchester being significant. I think it was initially covered by the Times, and there's a lot of coverage around it. There are significant issues in the northwest, which seems to match against what we're looking at. I mean, all these headlines say the same. Looking at mental health, as I say, that is clearly a significant issue. As far as we're concerned, debt is a significant issue. So I think it's really borne through that what our findings. Okay, Heidi. So this is just a breakdown on what we found with our registrations on VRS. Apologies for the overlap on the graph there. I think I've changed that graph about 6 times. It obviously hates me. But these are the breakdowns of what people are registering with us about. And the significant areas are really financial capacity, financial hardship, and mental health remain the big sort of red flags, if you like. And looking at what's registered, I think one of the interesting findings, a lot of this is a little bit predictable. A lot of it is perhaps what you would expect, but it's a minority, but it's a significant minority of the people that are registering with us are what you would call from comfortable households. It's 14%. And the only slant that I can really identify with that is that these are people that very often sort of decent salaries, but potentially large mortgage, young children, lots of childcare, various pressures coming to play that's just sort of tipped it over the edge. And perhaps the pandemic has contributed to that. But I think that's the area really where you perhaps wouldn't expect vulnerability to show itself. But many of the people that we're looking at, typically very little savings, income lower than average, high occupancy family areas, lower representation, as I said, from rural communities. There is a high dependency on benefits, and very much council, housing association, accommodation focused. And that carries through whatever the age range of people that we're looking at. That is one of the things that really, really stands out. High occupancy. And then another area is there is a lot of low internet use. And I think the important thing with that is that a lot of the places we're pushing vulnerable people to go and get help from is on the internet. And these people aren't often using the internet that much. So again, I think that's something we need to be very conscious of. Okay, Heidi. So, poorer pensioners, as I said, older people are less likely to identify as vulnerable. Significantly, people in the sort of 30, 35, 40 age group are more likely to say that they are vulnerable, recognise that they're vulnerable, even to the extent that with they would flag up physical disability, physical illness far more than the older people. But having said that, the people that we had, I think we can all recognise the fact that older people are vulnerable to an awful lot of different things. And I think some of the stats over there, which I mean are easy to find, we've got 3.2 million people over 80 in the UK. We've got 1.6 million people over the age of 85, 900,000 people living with dementia, of which I doubt that not one of them isn't vulnerable. They will all be vulnerable. And then at the same time, we've got 1.8 billion people with unclaimed, 1.8 billion, pounds, unclaimed pension benefit. And I think those hardships really are difficult to overcome. I mean, again, going back to myself, I do apologise, but having just filled in an attendance allowance form for an 89-year-old lady, it is not straightforward and it's not easy for me. If I was putting it straight in front of her, I'm sure it wouldn't have ever been filled in. So I think there is a lot to do. The people that we have got on the database tend to be poorer pensioners. I think we need to all start to try and look at how we encourage registrations and manage to identify where there is vulnerability in pensioners and older people. Certainly we're very good at data sharing. Credit referencing has been around for 40 odd years now. What we don't do yet is really share data about people in terms of how and when they need support. And I think it's very true in terms of older people. And they're the people that probably aren't greatly represented in terms of financial affairs. They're probably more stable, they're less likely to get credit. You've still got a large proportion of older people with thin files. You've got that sort of generation where the wives, I suppose, probably didn't inherit the credit history from their husbands. Still, you've got all those aspects into account. So in terms of data sharing, I think is probably a big area to really push to and look at. So registrations from older people, as I say, come from poorer areas. Again, you're seeing the same sort of accommodation, residential situations, reliance on benefits and state pensions, low chance of savings or investment, and again, low internet use, preferring traditional methods of communication, traditional methods of dealing with finances. There is a big focus on utilities, which again makes sense. And again, I think we need to be conscious those people are at risk as much as anybody of coercion and scams and really being exploited. So I mean, I just feel quite strongly that's an area, and I think it hammers home the importance of increasing the way we data share. We're not scared about holding details, and quite sensitive details, about people's financial histories, and we've been doing it for years and years. We're increasingly moving to open banking. We're very conscious that if we do a search on the internet of a product, we're going to see 25 adverts ping up in our Facebook or whatever it may be. So I would say sharing data with the intention of supporting people can't be that difficult to actually move to. And then the last slide, Heidi. These are just, I mean, as I say, 35 to 40, 30, 35, 40. These are the people that are significantly coming forward and registering with us. And again, the common trends here: large families surviving on benefits, council or housing accommodation, social rented and terraced housing, quite often some first-time buyers who've probably got a mortgage with a very long period to run, young adults and single parents, a lot of under 35s with young children, often a lot of benefit claimants. Also, in these areas that we've looked at, there is a high proportion of the health problems been identified, and of course indebtedness as well. So all of these results we are going to summarise. We're going to pull together in a report which we will share with all of you as soon as we've done it. I think any observations that you have or any thoughts that you have, we would really welcome from you. Those are our findings today. There's lots and lots of bits of information that we have out there. So, I mean, that we really wanted to just share that with you. And as I say, any thoughts that you have would be really helpful. I think Heidi just has a last poll. I think as we all feel, or predominantly feel, that data sharing is probably the way to go to. I mean, this question really is, what do you feel prohibits data sharing around vulnerability? So if you want to complete that, I'll leave it with Heidi to share it when she's got the results. Heidi's you're on mute, Heidi.
Yeah, they're still pressing their buttons. So we're up to a couple more buttons now, please, people. Okay. Right, so we're up to 80%. I'll share the results for you. There you go.
Which is a scary result, and sadly I'm not that surprised. I mean, the last webinar we did was around data protection, and we had 200 people register for it because of that fact, to try and look at the data protection aspect of it. And I think going back, I mentioned earlier, credit reference agencies have been going for 40 years, and data sharing isn't done on the basis of consent. It's done on the basis of subject to contract primarily, and we don't think twice about it. And yet sharing data because we're trying to support people and help people, we suddenly become scared about data protection. And I think you're all right. I think there is a perceived fear around data protection. The reality is it isn't a barrier. Most of the time we can gain explicit consent to share the data, and I think the results of our survey show that to be true, in that an awful lot of people are quite happy to have their data shared about vulnerability. I know none of us want labels particularly, but I think people are prepared to clearly prepared to share the information. And if we can't get explicit consent, we can still share data if it's appropriate to do so on the basis it's going to seriously impact somebody from a financial perspective, it's in the public interest, etc. And we've got a page on our website where we've nicked very straight from Rob Bell and the work that he did with Chris Fitch around when you can share data. So I think, yes, there's probably more we need to do around that. But that's it from me. Thanks ever so much for joining. I hope it has been useful. If you have any thoughts apart from what we're going to cover off now, if you want to contact us directly, even if you totally disagree with everything I've said, I'd really welcome them, because I think it's important that we get all those things out and talk about them, really.
That's great. Thanks so much, Helen. I've shared that link in the chat for which Rob Bell kindly provided us, which we've got on our website. So if anybody wants to have a read of that, that's fine. I'm more than happy to send anybody a link to our previous webinar on data protection when I send out the link for this webinar. So you can look at both if you'd like. So we've got one question that's in the message box at the moment from Chris Jones from VCX, saying, do you think it's fair to say that we are no longer a keep calm and carry on society? Your data suggests that younger people appear to associate with vulnerability and expect preferential treatment, rather than older people that might sweep it under the rug. What do you think, Helen?
I think so. I think there's lots of reasons. I think probably the world of social media has changed the way people express things. I think there's probably a bit of stoicism in the older generation, and also going back to the fact they don't have internet access to the same extent. And I don't think there are the same routes to express it, but that doesn't change the fact that perhaps they don't consider themselves to be vulnerable. But that doesn't mean that they don't need support, even though they might not put that label, as I say, against them. But I think you're right, Chris.
Right, yeah, Josh has replied directly to me, but I think he meant to send it to everybody, saying he thinks that Chris is correct. There is a lot of media presence around mental health and vulnerability that the younger generations absorb, and wish there was more focus on gambling and vulnerability, as there are a lot of young people who gamble. In Josh's experience, the older generation very much do keep calm and carry on.
Yeah, I think the stats that we asked specifically about addiction and gambling, and certainly it wasn't something that, again, older particular. I think it was a particular area that not many of the older people sort of identified with.
Yeah, Denise Ord has asked if we are going to share the stats behind the data contained in the presentation, which Heidi has kindly said, yes, we're going to be sharing the presentation afterwards, and we're going to be sharing the link today for the recording as well. Has anybody got any more questions? If anyone wants to raise a virtual hand or drop anything into the chat, please do feel free. Anybody?
Everyone's very quiet today. Somebody must have something to say.
Well, either I've talked you into submission, or it's too hot, or but I mean, I'm glad to see that there is that appetite for data sharing. I think there's massive, and throughout my sort of time working on this, which has been 5 years now, I don't think there's any lack of recognition that there is a need to share data. I think it's a very complicated world out there. There's lots of sectors working on it. They all have their own nuances, their own protocols, their own bureaucracy, I suppose, in a working group. And it is very difficult to pull all that together. But I think the end game is the same on the whole. I think there are barriers, and you've identified certainly the data protection one. I think there is also a priority in terms of resource and cost. There isn't a big stick coming necessarily from the regulators where there's going to be huge fines imposed. So it is going to play a part in the decision-making process. But my argument is always, we're holding a growing database. Every single one of those people on that database have identified as vulnerable. And I think there is a merit in a check, a low-cost check being made of that. I think those checks should be made as a matter of course, in the same way as you do a credit reference agency check or an affordability check. I think it should become a given. And the more people that start to use the data, the more it will be effective, the more motivation there will be to actually provide data, and the whole thing will become a self-fulfilling prophecy. So thank you all, and any thoughts that you have outside of this, we'd really welcome.
Yeah, Josh has sent us a message saying it'd be interesting to see if people that live in built-up cities or towns suffer with vulnerability more than people that might live in more rural locations, which is interesting because I would have thought that before COVID happened that you were more likely to suffer with vulnerabilities when you were living in a more rural location, such as those that live by the seaside, obviously during the colder months of the year, and if you're a younger person, less able to do things. But post COVID, obviously it doesn't matter, you're not going to be able to do things as much as you would have been.
The results in terms of that are emphatic in that the more rural the area, the less likely, and that's obviously driven partly by because less people live there. But I think it's certainly city based. It's certainly major areas.
Okay, great. Denise Ord said thank you for the opportunity to join today. She's happy to link in with anyone that would like to connect as they're looking to run a pilot within the Cabinet Office. So thank you for that, Denise. That's really helpful. Has anybody got any last sort of burning questions? You want to raise a virtual hand? No? Going. On. Oh, thank you, Stuart. Stuart says no, thank you. Okay, well, I suppose we'll wrap up a little bit early then, so you guys can get away and get your cups of tea half an hour earlier than you'd have hoped to. So that's really great. Thank you all so much for coming today. I think it's been a really thought-provoking event today. It's really interesting to see the sort of different stats that we've got with regards to vulnerability. If anybody has any questions later on down the line, I've popped mine and Helen's email addresses into the chat box, and you're more than welcome to get in touch with us to discuss further. Thank you all very much. Thank you, and thank you to Heidi for facilitating today. Heidi Malgan, absolutely admin.
Thank you very much, Kirsty. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks,
Have a good
guys.
day.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks a lot. Cheers.
All right.
Stay cool.
Stay cool. Be nice if you could.
Yeah.